Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures' Daily Dose of Nature, Wild Horses, Charismatic and Controversial, presented by Nat Hab Expedition Leader, Aaron Bott. Aaron, thank you very much for being here with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm really excited to be here with you. I wish we could be speaking together and communicating one-on-one, or at least as a presenter to an audience in present, but unfortunately, this is the best we've got right now. I'm really excited to be talking about wild horses, which is an issue that I am heavily involved with. And without further ado, I'll get started because we've got a lot of ground to cover today. Oh, hold on one second. There we go. Really quick, an introduction. As was stated, my name's Aaron. I'm a wildlife biologist. I work for government agencies. I'm also a PhD wildlife ecology student researching large carnivores in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So I am very involved in the public processes and the controversies of wildlife management. Again, I really specialize in large carnivores. I do grizzly bears and wolves and mountain lions, but I also research coyotes, and I deal with just about every other species that we have here in the American West. I'm from the American West, born and raised. My family's been here for the last 160 years. We settled out here in the 1840s, and I'm happy to say that this is a place that I'm very passionate about. I've given several other webinar presentations for Natural Habitat Adventures, talking about everything from trophic cascades to desert beavers, to grizzly bear management, to human history in the American West. Last time I gave a presentation, it was about beavers, and for some reason we got on topic of wild horses, and some of the viewers encouraged me to do a presentation on wild horses. So that's why I'm here today. To begin with, I live in a very rural and remote area of the American West. Currently, I'm here in southeastern Utah, and when I go out to work, it's usually to do some form of wildlife capture or research project, and oftentimes this is my experience on my commute. I'll be driving along a dirt road, and suddenly there will be horses that come out of nowhere, it seems. Oftentimes they'll be running along the road and they are ownerless. And in the section of the state that I live in, these are designated as wild, free roaming horses. And I'm gonna talk a little bit more about their definition and a little bit about their history here in the United States. Some of you may be aware that they're a little bit controversial. Definitely they're charismatic, these incredibly beautiful and wonderful animals. I deal mostly with large carnivores, and for some reason I'm really attracted to controversial species. Wolves definitely are the #1 species of controversy when it comes to public relations and public management. Humans have been interacting with wolves for millennia, and we often see these animals as a species. We see these animals as a symbol. We've generated ideas and images that are ingrained in our culture, and they're not so much biological entities as they are interpretations of our world values. And if it's not the wolf, then out here, definitely the horse is, I would say, the second most controversial species. I have to answer a lot of questions about management and about health of the herds, of the populations, of the species in general, their biology and their ecology. And there's a lot of people that have a lot of big feelings about horses. Some of those feelings are admiration, love, respect, and some folks have emotions that are more grounded in hate or anger or frustration. Now, the horse is not the wolf, obviously, and I think most of us can realize why there's so many big feelings about the wolf. Wolves are predators, they can compete with us, they can potentially be dangerous, but what is it about the horse that evokes so many feelings. We're going to get a little bit into that. So out here in the West, when you're talking about horses, you can encounter two kinds of people. Some people just really are all about the horse. They get really excited about it. To them, again, the horse is kind of like this black beauty, this secretariat, this majestic that really symbolizes the spirit of the city, that really symbolizes the American West. But to some other people, the horse represents government mismanagement of resources, restrictions on private rights, public majority or vast majority versus private rights, and it can be pretty upsetting to some folks. But ultimately, you can boil down kind of this whole issue to whether horses are native or not native. And before we get into the controversy, I'd like to first start talking about the evolutionary history and the biological makeup of these animals. So we'd like to begin by talking about the evolutionary perspective of the horse. Some people don't understand that horses were absent from the North American landscape for a long time. Some people also don't understand that horses actually evolved in North America. So how is it that we had this species originate here on this continent and then go absent for several thousand years, and now we have them again? Let's talk about that. Are horses native? Are they not native? Back in the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which was this period millions of years ago, 30 million years ago to 50 million years ago, North America had a very different climate. It was warm and it was covered in damp forests. And about 53 million years ago, the horse originated here in North America. In fact, today in modern Wyoming, we find lots of fossils of the progenitor of the horse. This is the progenitor. This is the Dawn horse. The whole story begins with this guy. He is the oldest recorded ancestor of the horse that we have to date. Again, about 53 million years ago. You can see that this animal was about the size of a small dog. It looked horse-esque, but it had a lot of biological and physiological adaptations that were not super similar to the horse that we would recognize today. Its size and stature definitely being one of those features that does not resemble our modern horse. But horse evolution is a story of adaptation and radiation in response to climate. So 53 million years ago, when we had this wet, forested environment in North America, these little horse creatures were running around, eating leaves and foraging in the woods. But as the climate changed over millions of years, we had cooler and drier environments that equaled more grassland. And more grassland produced more forage for horses. And in turn, they began to evolve and adapt to meet the demands of their environment. So over millions of years, we had finally, in 17 million years ago, we had the rise of the first true equine. So the horse began to take form and become what we would recognize as the horse 17 million years ago here in North America. Some of the interesting traits that the horse developed were hypsodont-like teeth. These teeth basically erupt from the jaws and they continue to grow as they're worn down. Grass and sedges are extremely fibrous and they can take their toll on teeth. And so these teeth are highly adapted to chew and chew and chew without wearing down permanently. Also in their leg bones, their toes fuse together, eventually just becoming a single toe. So these animals are of a group known as perissodactyls. Their relatives include tapirs and rhinos, so odd-toed mammals that roam all over the world. But the horse is definitely the most common that we have today. You can also see that their leg bones fused together, and with one toe that gave them more support for heavier weight. As the animals became bigger, it also stabilized their running capabilities. Now, about 2.5 million years ago, we had a biotic interchange where animals from North America in this situation crossed on the Bering Land Bridge into Eurasia. This biotic interchange has been happening for millennia. We are aware that humans came across from Eurasia into North America about 20, maybe even 40,000 years ago, but here we're talking about 2.5 million years ago, during the beginning of the Great Glaciation period, known as the Pleistocene. The oceans shrank as they were frozen and encapsulated into these large shields of ice, and it created this massive bridge, 500 or more miles wide, where animals migrated from one continent literally across an ocean into another continent. So during this time, horses migrated from North America into Eurasia. And at this time, we also had a great diversity of horses. As the genus was expanding and growing across the globe, we had more than a dozen genera that roamed the northern hemisphere. This is a great illustration by Mark Hallett that I've enjoyed since I was a child. It includes lots of different horses. This is a paleo artist's take on what they might have looked like. But as they spread into Eurasia, we had other relatives that diverged and broke off. One of these includes the zebra. Meanwhile, here in North America, the horses went extinct about 14,000 years ago. So what happened? We have this incredible species, highly adapted to a specific environment, large plains, large grasslands. They do so well that they're able to dominate pretty much the known world at that time. They go into Eurasia, they go into Africa. The only places they don't make it are the islands and into Australia and Antarctica, but they really dominate the world globally otherwise. But suddenly here in North America, we have an abrupt extinction. So what happened? Well, a couple of things took place here in North America and globally, but in North America, we had the end of the Pleistocene about 14,000 years ago. And the end of the Pleistocene was the end of the Ice Age, and the climate changed. And as it changed rapidly, that affected animal migrations, behaviors, a loss of habitat. But we also had at the same time the advent of humans coming into North America. And as humans came into North America, they utilized wildlife as a food source. And there are two competing theories right now about how the North American landscape changed, how we lost our mammoths, our mastodons, our horses, our giant ground sloths, all of these charismatic, large megafaunal species that used to roam across the Americas. What happened to them? How did they go extinct? The two competing theories, climate change, as well as the Blitzkrieg hypothesis, where humans come in and they exploit animals that had no interaction with people before and were naive to the dangers that humans proposed as large group hunters. These two competing theories probably worked in tandem, and ultimately we had the great die-off of our horse herds, but also our mammoth herds, our mastodon herds, etc. We know that from archaeological findings that Paleolithic Americans did hunt horses for food. We found remains, fossils with arrowheads, and much later Clovis points and spear points in history where these animals were supplying people for a food source. But in any case, for whatever reason, climate, human hunting, or overexploitation, the horse went extinct. They were common in the fossil record, they go absent, and they're gone. Meanwhile, in Eurasia, horses are doing pretty darn good. And about 6,000 years ago, we have the first documented case of horses being domesticated by humans. This took place in what is modern Kazakhstan. The Botai people on the Asian steppes first domesticated the horse, probably for food resources. So there's a lot of archaeological evidence to say that they rounded them up. They used these animals for milking, but they also used them for culling and for meat production. So it's easier to raise your livestock to slaughter them so that you don't have to go out hunting. But eventually, people began to domesticate these animals for riding. And the rest, you could say, is history. I can't emphasize enough how important the domestication of the horse was to humanity's history. It changed everything, from the Greeks, the Egyptians, to the Norman conquest. Everything changed. It was perhaps the greatest technological advancement that humanity had seen to that time. I would argue even greater than the wheel and greater than a lot of the weaponry that was being produced and invented and re-altered at that time. Of course, as humans domesticated wildlife, the horse in particular, we moved from natural selection into artificial selection. And by artificially selecting species of horses, we were basically taking the power of altercation into our own hands. We were creating different breeds adapted to perform different tasks. Everything from this to this. Horses are remarkably intertwined with our lives. We've used them for their literal horsepower to help us perform great tasks of labor, but we've also used them for warfare and for our own purposes of recreation and agriculture. So where does this guy fit in? The horse whisperer. You might recognize Robert Redford's character here. Here we are, the American cowboy in the West. We don't have horses, but they're dominating human history elsewhere. So how did we go from no horses in North America after they'd gone extinct to suddenly having horses come back to North America? Well, in 1519, horses were brought with Spanish explorers and they landed on the continent of North America, modern Mexico, and they began to be utilized just like they had been utilized elsewhere across the globe for agrarian purposes, but also for purposes of conquest. The peoples who had been living here in North America, Central America, they had been absent the horse for millennia. And the Blackfeet tribe in particular referred to the time before the horse as the dog days. The dog had been domesticated 20 to 40,000 years ago, depending on different archaeological findings. The dog was brought with humans as they crossed the Bering Land Bridge and inhabited North America. The dog was very familiar and it was a dependable resource and companion to the native peoples. And for millennia, they depended on the dog, not just for companionship, but in some cases for food and also for work and labor. And again, the Blackfeet and many other Northern Plains tribes refer to the time before the horse as the dog days because they were so dependent on the dog for work. But then suddenly you have these Europeans coming in great number and they bring with them the horse. And this is a quote from Coronado, the explorer, saying, "Next to God, we owe everything to the horses." I can't imagine what it must have been like to be here in the Americas and to experience people coming across the ocean and then charging around on horseback. This incredible animal that you had never seen before, giving people the advantage of height, but also power and speed. It must have been tremendous. Again, this incredible biological technology that came with Europeans was devastating in many ways to the native peoples who tried to resist the conquistadors and other westward expansions that we're about to talk about. So again, I can't say enough about how incredible the horse was in transforming the lives of the indigenous peoples here in the Americas. As the Spanish colonized Mexico and the Southwest, they forbade indigenous peoples from owning or riding horses. And as we're familiar, many atrocities took place and a lot of native peoples were enslaved. They were called out to do menial tasks such as taking care of livestock and horses, but they were forbidden from owning or riding any horses. That's just how powerful of a tool and or weapon the horse could be, depending on who was in the stirrups. But in 1680, the Pueblo Revolt overthrew the Spanish. This is a violent uprising by the Pueblo peoples, basically banishing the Spanish from the Southwest temporarily. And in doing so, the horse was, you could say, unleashed. So for over a century, horses had been in North America, but their populations had been restricted to expansion. Native peoples were withheld, or the horse was withheld from the native peoples. But ultimately, horses became a revolutionary technology for the Native Americans. And I could do an entire presentation just on how influential the horse was in the hands of the Native American peoples. Some biologists, ecologists, and anthropologists speculate that this was actually the beginning of the end for the buffalo. Prior to the horse getting in the hands of Native Americans, many peoples depended on hunting and scavenging and collecting fruits and berries and foraging on foot. And as far as meat went, especially if you were out on the Great Plains where you had massive bison herds, you didn't have a lot of ways to take advantage of that meat unless it was by foot, and it expended a lot of energy to time to follow those migrating herds. But suddenly, with the advent of the horse, the peoples, the Comanche in particular, the Apache, then the Comanche, all the way up to the Cheyenne, the Lakota, the Shoshone, the Blackfeet, the Ute, they took advantage of the horse and they were able to suddenly follow the bison as they migrated across the plains. This is a new image that I think is important for us to recognize too. We often associate these magnificent Lakota war bonnets with all Native American tribes sitting astride this magnificent horse. This is the image that we have seen popularly presented by Hollywood and our mythology here in America. But what's really interesting to me, and I think should be interesting to all of us, is that the Northern Plains tribes had the horse for only a few decades prior to Euro-American contact. These peoples were immensely talented as horse lords, basically creating these incredible mosaics of empires across the American landscape. They adopted the horse and brought it into their culture. But it's important for us to recognize that this was just a blip in history, that the peoples who were living here only had the horse for just a few decades prior to Euro-American contact. Again, you had the Apache that were involved with the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. They began to trade and to steal and to share horses with neighboring tribes, including the Comanche. Comanche were related to the Shoshone, and the Shoshone fought against the Blackfeet. And as is recorded in 1770, the Shoshone, on a skirmish with the Blackfeet, basically licked the Blackfeet pretty good in a battle, because they had suddenly this incredible new technology, this biological technology that they could use to their advantage. And it just really transformed the whole culture that these peoples had hitherto had. Suddenly the plains became a great area that was coveted by many peoples, because you could supply enough meat for your peoples, and you had enough grazing resources for your horses. And so you had these incredible horse masters that roamed all across North America. In the 19th century, as many as 2 million horses may have roamed North America. All of this was due to not only indigenous peoples trading and sharing and stealing horses, but also just the propagation of the species as a whole. Horses are extremely fecund. That means they can reproduce very readily. They're very adaptable as long as they have enough food and water. And ultimately, the horse population radiated from the Southwest and covered just about everywhere.
Unfortunately, we're going to leave Native American history just for a minute, but I'd like to come back to it in a little while, I hope. But I want to emphasize that the horse 15,000 years ago that lived in North America is genetically matched with the horses that are here today. Obviously, through mitochondrial DNA analysis, we can find that there are some differences, but essentially it's the same species. Our species our wild horses today are slightly larger due to artificial selection, but essentially it is the same animal that once roamed North America 15,000 years ago. Now, often we hear the term Mustang get thrown around. This is a anglicized bastardization of the Spanish word for mustango, which references wild cattle. So essentially it was a term used by Spanish cowboys to refer to any livestock that was wild, or you could say even feral, on the landscape. As it's been anglicized, it's become a sole definition for the wild horse that we recognize today, and it's really become a popular American folk hero. Everyone always talks about the hardiness of the wild mustangs. We have vehicles named after mustangs. We have sports teams named after mustangs. But that's where you get the term Mustang, and it really was first associated with early domesticated, gone feral horses, but now it's pretty much used loosely for any kind of horse that is out on the landscape. Now, with westward expansion, we had a whole new culture that came to the playing table. As Europeans began to expand westward, they brought with them their own worldviews and their own perspectives, the good critters and the bad critters, if you will. These are my family members, these are my ancestors coming out west, and I like to point out that these people weren't evil. There was a lot of negative effects to the environment that were done by naivete, by a lack of understanding, but the whole idea of ecology and coexistence with the landscape is relatively a new concept. It's a new mode of understanding that began in the 20th century. But in the 19th century, people didn't realize the negative repercussions that might take place by extirpating the bison herds or by extirpating the wolf packs and the grizzly bears. They simply perceived the landscape differently. There were animals that were economically viable to your survival, and there were others that tried to upset that balance as you perceived it. And ironically, the horse didn't make the list. It did in the beginning, but as more and more people poured westward, lands began to shrink. And this is a common conception that I like to emphasize time and time again whenever I'm talking about the American West. If you've been out here, if you've driven across the Western country, if you've been through the badlands of the Colorado Plateau, if you've been through the rugged forests of the Northern Rocky Mountains, it seems like this land is limitless, but it is in fact very limited. And as more people moved westward, these horses, these wild horses that were roaming around, at first seemed like an excellent commodity. People could round them up, they'd rope them, they'd tame them, and they'd basically have like a free automobile, if you will, at their fingertips. My family had Mustangers, they broke them. My great-great-great-grandfather worked for the Pony Express, and he rode a horse that was a Mustang that he broke. But as more people came west and more land was used up for human needs, we basically had to create an economy that did not support wildlife, and it did not support, in this case, wild horses on the landscape. And so there was this age of Mustangers removing horses from the landscape, where suddenly it was okay to have lots of horses. It was this romantic ideal. But as the frontier of the West began to close, it suddenly wasn't okay to have these wild animals because they caused property damage and they were a nuisance. This is the same attitude that we see in our large carnivore management, and also our other ungulate species or other hoofed animals people forget that one of the primary reasons why we depleted our bison herds and our elk herds and our pronghorn herds is because we saw those animals as competition for our livestock. Again, the good animals versus the bad animals. And the Mustang eventually just lost its worth. And so people began to try to remove or eradicate these animals. Some people tried to capitalize on the Mustang as they lost their worth in the public's perception. Some people began to say, hey, we should take these animals and we should break them and use them and sell them as tame horses, or what would be more easy is to round up the horses and to ship them off to slaughter. This is the pinnacle of the American industrial age, just a few decades behind the Industrial Revolution of England and Europe. But suddenly we have these great meat factories that are popping up, and they're really encouraging the slaughter of livestock, and people are saying, hey, we've got all these wild horses all over the place. Let's grind up horses and let's feed them to our pets. That's a cheap and easy way to make a dime. This is pretty interesting because as I mentioned in my earlier slide, there's a lot of evidence to show that horses were originally domesticated for meat. People ate horses during the Pleistocene. We ate them during their original domestication, and all over the world they are still consumed by a lot of peoples. They're considered a prey species. Animals have consumed them for millennia. But today in America, it's very taboo for us to eat a horse, again, because of what it symbolizes. It's like eating a dog. But I also like to point out that there are a lot of countries that eat dogs today. But as far as America goes, this is taboo, and it wasn't just recently did it become taboo. It's been taboo for a long time. And so as people were capitalizing on the slaughter of horses and shipping them off to meat factories to be canned and to be sold to people or to pets, there was a lot of retaliation. And this huge wild horse population that got to be as large as potentially 2 million got as low as 17 to 20,000 left. And it became pretty alarming for a lot of people who saw, again, the horse as a symbol of the American West. And you had folks like Wild Horse Annie, or Velma Johnston is her real name, who became a big advocate in the 60s to help shut down meat factories, and also she worked really hard in passing what became known as the Wild Horse Annie Act, which basically prohibited the use of vehicles or aircraft from capturing and killing wild horses. So it became a really big tool that helped prevent the last of the wild horses from going extinct from the landscape. And again, as public sentiment changed, the Wild Free-Roaming Wild Horse and Burros Act of 1971 came into fruition. So this is a time in our country's history when ecology, the environment, wildlife was a bipartisan issue, and folks, especially in the West, became concerned that the wild horse and the wild burros, which unfortunately I don't talk a lot about in this presentation, they are going under, and they're going under fast. And so Congress basically passed this act that protects these animals indefinitely. And I'll go ahead and just read this. This is straight from the act. It says, Congress finds and declares that wild, free-roaming wild horses and burros are symbols of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West. They contribute to the diversity of life forms within the nation and enrich the lives of the American people. It is the policy of Congress that wild, free-roaming horses and burros shall be protected from capture, branding, harassment, or death. Now, this is really interesting because this is not the Endangered Species Act of 1973. This is a completely different and separate act. I'm going to back up here just for a second. This is 1971, 2 years prior to the Endangered Species Act. And if you read the language here, the reason why the wild horse was considered worthy of congressional protection was because the animal is a symbol of the historic and pioneer spirit of the West. It's not because they have some ecological reasoning for protecting the species, which is what the Endangered Species Act came about for. The Endangered Species Act was about protecting species for the health and the integrity of the environment and ecosystems. But the Wild Horse and Burros Act instead was created just because wild horses were threatened. Their numbers were dwindling, and people were disturbed by the inhumane methods in which wild horses were being rounded up on the landscape and shipped to slaughter. So this is one of the very few cases in the American government's history where we have declared a special status to a certain species or species lumped together in a large group. So the other two prominent examples of this would be the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, which passed around this same time. So all bald eagles and golden eagles are federally protected, and also marine mammals are protected within the United States. So whales and seals, etc., dolphins, they're protected from any harassment, capture, or killing. But the federal horse and burros also made that cut. So again, this is not the Endangered Species Act. It's very different. This is something that is irrevocable unless Congress decides to revisit the issue. Now, we toss around wild versus feral a lot. So you had all of these domestic horses living with the Spanish, living with the Native Americans, living with the cowboys, and some of them go off on their own, and now they're roaming across the landscape, hanging out in large bands or herds. What is the difference between wild and feral? I get a lot of people who don't like wild horses, and they just refer to them as feral horses. Well, in this case, wild is a legal definition. So if you're talking about a wild horse, according to the legal definition, you are only referring to any horse or burro that is free roaming on federally designated management lands. So I'll explain this a little bit more in depth in just a second. When the Wild Horse and Burros Act was passed in 1971, someone needed to manage the Wild Horse and Burro project. And by default, that agency that became responsible for the wild horse and burros was the Bureau of Land Management. The BLM, or the Bureau of Land Management, oversees more than 10% of the land in the United States. The Bureau of Land Management is under the Department of the Interior, and it was created separate from the Forest Service and the National Park Service as a way of managing lands for multiple use that otherwise were not wanted or desired. This is a lot of desert land in the West. So if it's not, or if it wasn't perceived as being valued at the time, after the Homestead Act, people didn't want to settle there. They didn't want to log there. They didn't want to really raise cattle there, perhaps. The Bureau of Land Management was created to manage and protect those lands. They are a multiple use agency, which means that they allow mining, they allow recreation, they allow cattle ranching, and they also protect wildlife and the environment at large. So very similar to the Forest Service, but in this case, it's mostly desert landscapes. So because the majority of wild horses and burros lived in the Intermountain West and in the Great Basin, and the majority of the lands that they lived on were managed by the Bureau of Land Management, by default, the horses and the burros went under their jurisdiction and their management plan as well. So the BLM, working as a federal organization with multiple groups, they generated tracts of lands or territories that were designated for wild horse and burro use. And you can see that they are kind of buckshot scattered all over the West here. The majority of them are in Nevada, but also into Utah, Wyoming, Idaho, Oregon, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and California. These are the lands where wild horses are designated as wild horses. This is where that legal definition fits into their their identity. Now, this map does not show all of the sovereign nations that belong to the Native American tribes that inhabit the West. In the Four Corners area of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, you have the Navajo Nation and the Hopi Nation. You also have the Apache. Right by where I live, I'm right next to the Ute Indian Reservation. And these tribes are sovereign nations, and they also have a lot of federally recognized wild horses and burros living on the landscape. So under the protection of the Wild Horse and Burros Act, the population has greatly increased. These animals are very fecund, as I mentioned before, and in fact, the population is capable by multiplying 20% annually, or doubling every 4 years. That's incredible. There are very few species of that stature, that size, that can reproduce that successfully every year. And so because of this, we suddenly have the crux of the issue or the problem. Before this, we've been talking about deep history, the ancient history of humans and their interactions with horses. Now the horse is protected. This is where we start to talk about why they're so controversial. So when the Wild Horse and Burros Act was passed in 1971, there was, as I stated, probably 17 to 20,000 wild horses on the landscape, including burros that brought the number up to about 25,000. Now, the animals that we have out here are living in a very arid environment. And that arid environment, ecologically, environmentally, limits the amount of bodies that you can have on the land just because there is a lack of water and a lack of vegetation. So wildlife living on the landscape are naturally regulated and limited by their environment just because there are not a lot of resources to go around. According to an assessment of the landscape and in the environment, we estimate that about 27,000 horses and burros can live on the landscape in balance with wildlife and livestock in order to keep the lands healthy and manageable. But at present, we have about 90,000 wild horses and burros living on public lands, which is many times the carrying capacity of this landscape. It's hard for people who don't live in the West to understand just how much space is required for a 1,000-pound animal to make a living. These horses drink 5 to 10 gallons of water a day in order to live healthy lives. But as the population is growing, you can see right there, up to nearly 90,000 animals, these horses are outgrowing the resources on the landscape. These numbers that you see in the states here show you just how many horses are on the landscape in each state. Nevada definitely has the most. Nevada is also, I'll point out, the driest state in the country. Utah is the second driest state in the country. And you have a lot of animals roaming around on this desert landscape trying to make a living. This is the Wild West. So this photo is actually from my house. So this is out looking to the San Rafael Swell, which is right by my house. It's beautiful. It's great. It's also very limited and what can live out there. Those little dots are pinyon pines and junipers. It's just not a great place to make a living. If you remember, wild horses evolved on grasslands, and we don't have grasslands out here in the West. Also, of course, climate change is a huge issue. This right now, it's extremely alarming, but this drought that we are experiencing in the American West right now is arguably the worst that we have seen in 1,000 years. And as the climate warms, as it gets drier, then we can expect the land to produce less vegetation and less water to meet the needs of people, of livestock, of wildlife, and of wild horses. This was released 2 days ago yesterday. This was released to the public yesterday, and I threw it on my slide. But this was an announcement that just came out from the federal government. Again, I'm currently living right now in Utah, and you can see that 99% of the state is in either an extreme or an exceptional drought. Things are getting really scary out here in the West. And as climate change progresses and advances, things are not going to get any better. So not only do you have thousands of horses living out here in the West in this arid landscape, but you also have multiple use. You have livestock, people who are trying to make their living grazing livestock out here when it's very difficult, when it's very challenging and the resources are limited. And of course, we also have native wildlife populations, pronghorn, mule deer, desert bighorn sheep. All of these animals need resources as well. And in this situation, we have what's known as exploitative competition. So desert bighorn sheep, which are regionally threatened in many areas of the West, they can be outcompeted for resources by large horse herds, which are a dominating species. They can be very aggressive towards wildlife, and they can outcompete wildlife for watering holes or for grazing. Horses are also very interesting because they have different morphological and physiological adaptations that allow them to eat differently and live differently when compared to cattle and deer and goats and sheep. They're not ruminants. All of your ruminants lack incisors on the upper jaw, whereas horses have incisors on the upper and lower jaw. This allows them to pull out plants in their entirety by the whole plant. They can uproot it and they can consume it, which decreases the forage available for other species on the landscape. Also, it's incredibly important to remember that horses are huge when you compare them to 120, 150 pound mule deer or desert bighorn sheep. Horses are 800 to 1,000 pounds. I mean, these are very big animals that require a lot of resources. Now, people often say, well, what about predation? Where are our predators? If we had wolves on the landscape, for example, would we be able to balance out the horse population? Well, horses did evolve in a very predator-dense environment. North America once had lions, not mountain lions, but actual lions in addition to mountain lions. We had dire wolves, and we had short-faced bears, and we had many other large carnivores that preyed on horses. But all of these predators, here's a list of all the felids. Man, you've got so many of the saber-toothed cats. You had the American cheetahs. There's a skull of the short-faced bear, twice the size of our grizzly bear. All of these animals lived on the landscape when horses evolved here, but they've since gone extinct. And not only that, but the predators that we have left are pretty diminutive when compared to their great forebears, if you will. Wolves have been eradicated, but wolves have almost never been documented to kill horses, feral horses or wild horses. Mountain lions are stalk and ambush predators, and horses are often out on the range where mountain lions aren't. And in some cases, you have what's known in ecology as apparent competition, where you have mountain lions that are focusing all of their predation efforts on a much easier species to catch. In this case, it would be mule deer. Occasionally, and we have documented this, mountain lions do eat horses. But if we had more mountain lions, that would not mean more horses are getting eaten. In fact, there are some estimates that suggest that there are as many mountain lions in the American West today as there were when Lewis and Clark came out west. I gave a presentation on mountain lions, and it's pretty remarkable to see their recovery. But as far as the environment goes, this can be pretty upsetting to native species like mule deer or bighorn sheep that get targeted as easier prey when mountain lions have to pick what they're going to put on the menu. It's going to be an 800-pound horse or a 150-pound mule deer. They're most likely going to pick the mule deer. This is the takeaway. This is the biggest thing that I hope everyone realizes right now. I work, again, mostly with large carnivores, and I was recently talking to a friend about how there's a great parallel between our grizzly bear management and its evolving policies that we've seen in the last 70 years when compared to the Wild Horse and Burros Act. But essentially, our issue right now and why we're in the pickle we're in is because the wilderness has been restricted to barren lands that cannot support the amount of life it is asked to. Grizzly bears, we've created little pockets, isolated pockets for them to live in at high elevated mountain ranges where forage and the quality of life is difficult. And then we're surprised when grizzly bears come into towns or when they move out into the plains. And it's shocking to us because we associate wilderness with mountains. Oftentimes people associate wilderness with the great deserts of the West. But in reality, wildlife can't thrive in great abundance in some of these environments because the climate is just too arid. Remember, we talked about this. The evolution of the horse took place on grasslands, and the Great Basin is not the Great Plains. So people often, I think, lose sight of that when they argue, are there too many horses, yes or no? Regardless of I think that kind of petty argument, we have to consider that the landscape we have put these animals on is not capable of sustaining the populations that we have at present. The consequence of doing nothing is not an option because it causes irreversible environmental damage. So, just as a recap, the inhumane treatment of horses in the late 1800s and early 1900s led to federal protection. But the federal protection of these horses came perhaps too late, because by the time in the 1970s when we were protecting lands that wild horses could live on, all that was left was the Bureau of Land Management's wild horse pockets, these dry, arid landscapes that really are hard for anyone, whether you're a cattle operator, a mule deer, or a wild horse, to live in. And because of these wild habitat restrictions, we suddenly have ecological issues. And this graphic image was presented by the Navajo Nation, and it's very common throughout the West, where you have hundreds of wild horses that die of starvation or a lack of forage because the resources just simply aren't there. So how do we combat this? Well, historically, and what is currently going on, is the Bureau of Land Management operates these large gatherings, which can be very controversial. But I think the government is doing the best that they can with this current option, where basically they build these corrals and they fly these helicopters down and they round up horses in the thousands that then are relocated to holding facilities. So because of their federal protected special status, these horses cannot be slaughtered, but instead they are rounded up and they're put onto holding facilities where they await the opportunity to be adopted. If they're not adopted, they're put onto pasture on private and public lands in the Midwest. So the BLM has generated this adoption program, and they invite the public to participate in adopting and raising wild horses. But the problem is that over the years, since 1995, when they began this adoption process, people who are interested or were interested in adopting horses have adopted horses, but the population of horses continues to grow, again, doubling in size every 4 years. So here you have this graph that shows how, yes, you can briefly decrease the amount of horses you have on the landscape, but as the adoption market is oversaturated, suddenly the wild horse population on the West continues to rebound, and it's just this feedback loop that is very unsustainable. Currently there are 50,000 wild horses and burros that are waiting adoption, and this costs taxpayers $50 million every year to feed and to take care of these horses. This eats up about 2/3 of the BLM's budget. So again, this nasty feedback loop where we have a wild horse population problem in the West where they're living on an environment that is not sustainable. And we are trying to figure out how we can remove these horses in a non-lethal way and provide them a better future. But when we remove the horses, we're just basically putting them out to feed in the Midwest on private land mostly, and we're spending millions, tens of millions of dollars to keep these horses. Meanwhile, the wild horse problem in the West continues to grow. And again, this feedback cycle is negative and it doesn't really fix the problem. This leads to the two big complaints that we get a lot. Ranchers are claiming that the BLM is favoring horses at the expense of the land. They're frustrated because they see that there are just as many horses, in fact, more horses on the landscape than there were 10 years ago. And they're frustrated because they don't think the BLM is doing their job to try and mitigate the problem. Meanwhile, activists are claiming that the BLM is eradicating horses by removing them from the West simply for livestock interests. Of course, everyone hates the government. That's just how it goes. I get it. That's an American thing to bellyache. But I definitely feel for my friends who work in the wild horse program with the Bureau of Land Management as they try and handle this very frustrated system. Sovereign nations like the Navajo Nation are capable of doing things that we cannot do elsewhere in the country. And this includes opening up horse hunting. The Navajo Nation has a huge population of wild horses, and the Navajo Nation has a lot of environmental issues. They are struggling very much as an agrarian society with their sheep and their goats to provide enough resources in order to make a sustainable living for their communities. And they see all these horses gobbling up their resources as definitely a frustrating problem. And so very recently, the Navajo Nation proposed a wild horse hunt, asking people to hunt wild horses just like you would hunt deer or elk. But again, because of the cultural taboos, this got really nasty, and the Navajo Nation canceled the hunt before it got underway. So how do we solve this issue? There's not one way that we can solve it. There's a lot of different things that we're researching and we're looking into. We're working on sterilizing horses in the wild, trying to reduce their populations, which can be very costly, and you also have to, in many cases, reapply the drugs that sterilize these animals year after year. But we're also finding ways to partner with people who are willing to adopt more wild horses, and we're taking them to good homes, and we're trying to be more proactive. And we're also networking with a lot of people who are providing pastures in the Midwest, thankfully, that are making good homes for wild horses as we transport them from the West to the Midwest. Also, the BLM recently created the Adoption Incentive Program. So people who want to adopt a wild horse can get paid $1,000. This kind of curbs the edge of adopting a horse and the complications that might come with it, from paying for the hay to paying for a trainer, etc. And since this program was initiated a couple years ago, adoptions have increased by 62%. This is my last slide. I know I've gone long, you guys. I appreciate you sticking in here. Again, this is a pretty challenging issue, but I think that first and foremost, it's important for us as citizens to recognize that this is a difficult situation and there are challenges, and we have to make decisions because right now what is happening is not sustainable, especially in the face of climate change. As this landscape becomes drier and more arid, we're going to see more horses, more wildlife, and more livestock struggling to make a living out on the landscape. And at some point, something has to change. And I believe that that change begins with us becoming informed and recognizing that there is an issue, that it's not simply horses are charismatic and they're fantastic and we should just do hands off, because hands off is just not sustainable. Humanity has essentially disrupted the system to the point that wild horses are living in a Great Basin desert and not out on the Great Plains where they evolved. And we have to decide as a species what we are going to do and how we're going to bend and what changes we're going to need to make in order to create a more sustainable environment for these charismatic animals. With that, I conclude. So I'll pass it back to you. Thanks very much.
Aaron, thank you very much. It's very, very informative and interesting. I'd like to pass on that there are a number of personal thank yous from our regular viewers to you for putting this presentation together and speaking directly about the horses. So thank you for that. Interestingly, one viewer specifically mentioned remembering horse meat being available in grocery stores in the 1970s up in the Pacific Northwest.
Wow.
So it's not in that distant of the past by any stretch of the imagination. So just sort of anecdotally here, looking through the questions, I bet we have a lot of questions and comments today. I bet 60% or more, Aaron, are about sterilization and birth control of wild horses. Can you speak in a more direct way to that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. Perhaps I should have included some slides on that, but sterilization of horses is really a fantastic idea. It works very effectively to an extent. So the most common sterilization method is something known as PZP, which is a compound that can be extracted naturally from swine, actually, from pigs. And the complications that come with sterilization is it's not considered to be effective on a long-term scale for multiple reasons. One is it's very difficult to ensure that your population as a whole has been sterilized. And some of those methods of sterilization, including PZP, have to be reapplied every 1 to 2 years. To geld an animal or to take males and to castrate them is ecologically not very sustainable, because from a population standpoint, it's your females that are reproducing. So even if you were to, if you had 10 males and you castrated, or which is not an option, but if you sterilized 10 males, or excuse me, 9 of the 10 males, and you left 1 male, and you had 10 females, at the end of the year, you're still going to have 10 babies, just because the statistics of you missing a male are out there, and it's the females that are the reproducers. And so if you really want to hit sterilization hard, you have to target the females. Male sterilization works, it's just not a long-term option. And as far as female captures go, it's just super difficult to know where all of your horses are on the vastness of the landscape. And the amount of cost that goes into sterilizing the animals right now doesn't really offset the cost of or the benefits, I guess, that come from sterilizing the animals. That's to say, though, that's not to say that sterilization, I think, will become a more heavily researched subject that we look at in the future. So sterilization is a great tool that can be used. It is being used. Its efficacy is somewhat successful. We definitely have a long way to go before we come to a long-term solution.
Yeah, okay, very good. A few people are asking questions about sort of how these wild horses are kept within the boundaries that are set for them. So how are they kept on BLM land? How are they kept on the reservations for tribes like the Navajo?
They're not. So good question. It's kind of complicated, but these animals have the ability to roam wherever they want. So they are managed on those lands that are dedicated. That kind of pockmarked map that I showed you earlier. That's where they permanently are managed, but they do often range outside of those areas. And when they range, going back to that map, when they range outside, there it is. When they range outside of those areas, they can cause a lot of private property damage, or they're just simply ignored. Or they call in other officials that will then even potentially haze them back onto other areas where they are managed and removed. So when wild horse roundups occur, they occur generally here on this map in these designated areas. That's where the gatherings and the removals take place.
Okay, we have a couple fun questions lined up for you. I think this one's probably my favorite question today. Where did the term glue factory come from?
Well, I don't know where the etymology of the word glue is, but definitely glue is made from the waste matter of animals that is left behind. So hooves and horns and the hide in particular has been used by people for millennia. You boil it all down and it becomes a really rich protein paste that holds things together. So if you look at your emerald glue, Elmer's glue, there we go. If you look at your Elmer's glue, it has a cow on the front. That's its icon, because historically cows, and still in some cases today, cows are used to make glue, and horses the same thing. So
yeah. Okay. Earlier you said that horses were first used for milking when they were domesticated over there in Europe. So we have a couple of people asking, do you mean that people actually drank horse milk? And if that was true, why did we stop doing that?
that was true, and we didn't stop doing it. We just never started doing it here in the United States. But if you go elsewhere in the world, horse milk is a popular commodity.
Very good. One more for discussion for you, Aaron. Can you please speak about the recent Onaqui roundup in Utah and the BLM's process versus controlling the herds with birth control? I know you've spoken a little bit to this, but maybe specifically to the Onaqui roundup.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I could add a lot of insight on this other than the Bureau of Land Management schedules gatherings, as they call them, but they're roundups that take place every year throughout the year. In fact, if you're interested and if you live in the West, or if you want to travel out West, you can get on the Bureau of Land Management's website. They have a calendar that they share with the public that lets you know when they're going to be doing roundups and where. It's not secretive. It's very open to the public. Obviously, a lot of people are concerned. They want to make sure that things are going well. And so you can sign up basically to go watch a wild horse roundup. In Utah, we have been working, we have the map later. Let's see, I don't know where it was. It shows that California has a lot of wild horses, but Utah really has the second largest population of wild horses in the country. And so the wild horses in the state of Utah have been concerning to a lot of livestock owners and farmers, as well as wildlife advocates, because again, they're utilizing resources that need to be shared. And with livestock, you're typically rotating your pasture lands or your fields so that the livestock does not abuse a resource for too long. At least that's what should be happening in theory. And wildlife often migrate, but with wild horses being so large, they're constantly on the landscape, and they're constantly hammering the resources that are there. And so there was a very large roundup in Utah recently to remove horses and to try and put them onto a holding facility. I'm not exactly sure what else I could say about that right now, but it was essentially, or is essentially, a part of the program at large. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure what else I could say about that right now.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thanks for the direction to the BLM's resources online as well. It's very useful for people, I think. Well, Aaron, that's the last question we have time for today. With that, how about I'll hand it back to you for some closing comments?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you tuning in. Again, I wish that we could be visiting in person. It's very exciting to hear your questions and to hear your thoughts. This is a really controversial issue, and I hope that you have taken away some information that you can utilize for your own judgment on how we can maybe think sustainably in the future, how we're going to manage our wildlife populations, our horse populations. And again, maybe we can apply these lessons to other species and in other ecosystems. Again, my biggest takeaway personally is that we're losing a lot of wilderness. We're losing wild places, and some of the places that we culturally associate with wilderness are not sustainable for wildlife. Deer and elk and grizzly bears have a hard time living above 8,000 feet of elevation. They'd like to be in our backyards where there was once a lot of forage opportunity and grazing opportunity. But globalization is definitely an issue that we're having out here in the West, and climate change is another huge issue. So please do your research. I hope you learned some good stuff, and thank you very much for tuning in.
Well, thank you, Aaron, for taking the time to present for us today. We all appreciate it. I would like to also thank everyone who tuned in. Join us again on Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I will conclude today's webinar. Thank you, everybody. Have a good weekend.